Hey, Randy, episode 4.
Yeah, we're making progress.
If episode 3 made us a real podcast, I don't know what episode 4 does for us. So we'll see. To my knowledge, we have not made, 100%, we haven't made each other mad yet. So that's good. And to my knowledge, I don't think we've really made anybody else mad. So maybe tonight, if we keep trying, we can pull
We'll
that
keep
off.
working at it. We'll eventually hit a nerve with someone that will take us to task, but that's okay.
Yeah, I still, I think it's intriguing. I think my mom told me the other day that we may have to change this to the 90-10 podcast or the 95-5 podcast. um, Based on our lack of disagreement. I think it continues to play out. Our theory early on is two people sitting down having rational discussions, even though, if you have a 10-minute conversation, you might be able to disagree. But if you're able to have a respectful, nuanced discussion with an open mind, it's pretty amazing what happens. We need more of it. So we'll keep doing this until we get a few billion people to have this skill, and then there'll be world peace. So speaking of world peace, that's an unintentional segue into the topic for tonight. So episode 4, really trying to understand what is the United States role. So America's role in the world: leader, protector, or late responder. What are we? And I've got an upfront disclaimer. It's kind of like the car commercials where they got to read real fast. I'll read it slow, but I do want to highlight something. I thought a lot about this as I've been researching and thinking. You and I have the benefit of something that the people who were in the middle of each of the different things, I'm sure you'll bring up and then I'll bring up. We've got something they didn't have. We've got the ability to look back with the whole scenario and how it played out and be critical of that. So I do want to give a little bit of a upfront narrative of all of these things we're going to talk about as examples. They're level 10 decisions. They're hard.
Right.
And armchair quarterbacking with the perspective we have is easy. We've got a holistic picture now of how something that happened 40 years or 50 years or 60 years ago, how it played out. And it's easy to say, oh, that wasn't good. Shouldn't have done that. And so, my hope for this is that as we look at kind of each one of these scenarios that we help talk through of what is America's role, I really hope that by analyzing these past events and talking about what happened, that we can bring light and maybe at least you and I'll be able to make better decisions. But I would like to think that people who are in powerful leadership positions can look at things this way too and think differently, because I've got a number of stats through some of my examples of lives that were lost based on different engagements, and good intent or not on the front end, the net effect of a lot of these scenarios is lost life. So I would love to think as we talk through it, and more people can have conversations, that we're able to look back at some past events and again, not necessarily criticize because they were in situations making hard decisions that we weren't, but to highlight some areas and talk about it and maybe bring light to some events that, I don't know if we'll be able to decide which one of those 3 areas the United States should have been out in. I think it's gonna be a fun discussion, and I'm optimistic that we can bring light to some of the events that have happened, and maybe bring up some examples people have never heard of before and make people think about what our role is. But I have a suspicion that most people been out in one of those 3 areas, so I'm
Hmm.
curious to see what your thoughts are.
Well, I like, you and I've talked around this issue for years, uh, different aspects of it. I like, you came up with the title of this, and I like the way that I like what you came up with because you've highlighted 3, I guess, if not roles, at least perceived roles that the United States has had over its history as it relates to world events. The idea of, is it our job to be the leader? Are we the protector? Or are we the last responder? And I think the reality is, I don't think we can come up with a static answer to this. I think it has to be fluid based on what's going on in the world at the time. There are times when leadership is necessary on the part of not only individuals, but perhaps of individual nations. There are times when playing the role of protector perhaps is a role that is necessary for those who have that military capability or economic capability to play that role. And then there are perhaps times when simply being the last responder is the more prudent pathway to take. There are times when things are occurring that where we think we should respond early on, if you take a step back and you see that maybe it is not necessary. Sometimes we find that if we try to avoid being involved in whatever is going on in the world, that we reach a point where we are forced to be that last responder. Perhaps we have the only solution. It's one of the downsides to being one of the most powerful nations, if not the most powerful nation in the world. But I think part of what we have to look at as we answer this question is, how do we define leader? I mean, what exactly does that mean? If the United States is to be a leader in what? Who are we obligated to protect? I think we've discussed it before. We cannot police the entire world. We do not have the resources, nor do we have the technology to protect everyone out there that needs protection. And I think we have to seriously ask the question. It's a question that I don't believe is being asked and answered right now. What are we gaining by our response? If we're being a last responder to a situation, has there been any strategic thought as to what the accomplishment is, how we can extract ourselves? Are we going to go in as a late responder, try to accomplish a very defined goal, and then step out? And so I think these are questions that we have to ask. The role that we're going to have to play, or that we're going to be asked to play, I think is going to depend upon the circumstances.
Yeah. And I think something you said too, and you brought up, I think, one of the key points. And I think it's not just what we feel about our role. I think it's what a lot of others feel about our role.
Yes, absolutely.
And anything that happens in the world, it doesn't matter if it's instability, if it's war, if it's genocide, if it's a natural disaster, everybody looks to us and said, where's the United States, and what's the United States going to do about it? So, and I think again, there's a lot of pressure that I want to talk through at certain points. So it's internal. We feel pressure because we are very blessed in this nation. The freedoms that we have here and the ability to use resources, the resources we have, are one of the few nations in the world that can survive without a lot of help from anywhere else. We do have a lot of natural resources. Our form of government, good or bad, with the capitalistic nature, generates a lot of money, monetary wealth, which along with that comes the ability to affect other things. We've generated a lot of debt too. So I don't maybe maybe it's not all just the resources, but our use of debt's not great. But I do think along with it's the, to whom much is given, much is expected thing. I think there is a role, and I don't think we can sit back passive on everything. I think that the real crux of it is trying to discern, and you said something earlier that I completely agree with. It's the difficult part lies in the discernment of what to do in each scenario and what is our role. And we've kind of got these three that we've laid it out, but it's even more nuanced than that. But based on every natural disaster, every conflict, you know, if 1,000 people are killed by a government, all these different things, whether it's cartel, whatever's going on, they're so different. And then, just the upfront engagement is different. The scenario is different. And then the piece I'm not sure we think through well at all. Again, this is where I think we have the benefit of looking back at history. It's easy to see. It sure doesn't feel like the second and third, definitely not the fourth and fifth order effects, are analyzed very well. Looking at history and the things we've done, if so, we're not very good at it. We should do it differently, because we sure do repeat over and over and over. Regime change, put a new leader in, kill new leader, leave a vacuum. It's just a rinse and repeat of the same things. And I think, again, each one's nuanced, got it. But man, we don't seem to learn well from history, because we do the same thing over and over and over, which then starts begging the question of why do we do that? And I think that gets into a little bit deeper and maybe more sinister reason we do some of the things we do. And it's not just based on our three nicely bent out philanthropic engagement efforts to help the world. I think there's a worse side of all that if you start playing the cynic that I'll do in a minute. I think that part's fun, but I think there's a whole nother level that goes into these decisions that is not looking at necessarily what's best, even for our nation. Selfishly, I think it's not looking at what's best for another nation. I think the good old word money plays into money and control and resources. And it's funny how a lot of these countries we do choose to participate with have oil and other natural resources that are nice. So I think there's another level that it's not just this what's best for humanity. I don't think that's the lens this gets looked at through a lot. So I think it's a tough question. And I do think it's an interesting thing is, should the rest of the world be asking that question? Is it really up to us to be all of this, or should we step back entirely? I think that's
Right.
the question.
It's interesting. you hit on a couple of things here. Not only, it's important for us as Americans to determine, what is the perception on the part of the American people as to the roles that we should play in each of these scenarios, and contrast that to what the rest of the world's perception is of what the U.S. should be doing. And that will vary. We are finding that quite often our allies in Europe see us primarily as the ATM, the funder of things, maybe even the provider of military hardware. But then we catch an awful lot of flack in terms of the approaches that we take, how we determine to lead, or how we determine to protect, that sort of thing. And quite often, our perception of the role that we should be playing in a situation contrasts quite sharply with what not only uh, our allies, the role that they should, but how Russia and how China and how North Korea and how Iran see what should be the U.S.'s role, if indeed they believe that we should have any role at all. And the other thing, you hit on something that I took some time to, I tried to remember it all, but I'm not quite old enough. I was born during the Korean conflict, but I went back and looked at the United States history, particularly in conflict, because that's the thing that we all remember. Yes, there have been countless other issues in which the United States has stepped in and has shown leadership and has protected and has come in as sort of the last one to step in and resolve a particular situation. But when it comes to the conflicts, I didn't realize that in our entire history since the six or just prior, the United States has only had five declared wars. And, of course, it was, the Revolutionary War. We had the Mexican American War, the War of 1812, the Spanish American War. And then we had, of course, World War One and World War Two. And if you go back and look at all of those declared wars, they all definitely were centered around protection of our nation, the physical protection of our nation. And the first three, four of those, I guess there were six, because the first four of those prior to World War One took place right here around our continent, around North America. And definitely, well, one of them, I guess the Civil War is the one that you have to throw in there. And, but when you get to even World War One, World War Two is easy to see. I mean, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I did not really know the full story behind why we got involved in World War One, because we were at that time a very isolationist country, and we're not that interested, quite honestly, in what was going on in Europe. And I did not realize that the Germans, with their submarine fleet, which was relatively new in warfare, had determined that they would take the gloves off, and any ship that was in the Atlantic was fair game to be sunk. And we actually had some commercial ships that were sunk by German submarines. And then another thing that was not aware until I did a little research on it, what was basically the Secretary of State of Germany in World War One during that period, Zimmerman was his name, had uh, communicated with Mexico, the president of Mexico, trying to get Mexico to come on board and fight for Germany if the United States decided to enter into that conflict, with the assurance that Germany would help Mexico recoup portions of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, etc. And so once again, in both of those instances, we were protecting our own interests. So that runs the gamut through all of those wars up to the end of World War II. We have not had a declared war since then. And it's interesting when you look at where we have spent time and resources and blood. Of course, Korean War, which isn't officially over
Right.
at this juncture.
Yep. Just a
Vietnam,
ceasefire.
yeah. The Vietnam War, which was never officially anything other than a conflict or a police action, once again, did not turn out well for us. Then we had Desert Storm, which has just led to everything then, with the exception of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we were a part of NATO forces in that particular conflict. You've got Desert Storm, you've got the war in Afghanistan, you've got the Iraq War, you've got our intervention in Libya, you've got what's it called, Operation Inherent Resolve, which is an ongoing conflict that we are sort of caught up in there.
There's actually
Somalia and
there's
our
a
intervention in Somalia, and then of course now the Iran conflict.
there's a
All of this
memorial
picture.
here in there's a memorial here in Huntsville, and it is shocking to everything you're just saying. So the wars that are declared wars are on there, which I thought there were more, but then the number of conflicts, it's almost a 360-degree circle, and they're all listed, and the number of people that died. It is shocking the number of conflicts that we've been involved in. I mean, I
Yeah,
had no idea. Yeah, the big 15 or 20, but there's many, many more than that. Some are still ongoing. It's shocking.
and it begs the question, Carl, when you look back on those, what has been what, if anything, was the positive impact that came from any of that? I mean, there can be conjecture, but in terms of what was accomplished, it seems like every time we do something in the Middle East and leave for any brief period of time, it goes right back to being basically the same kind of regional conflicts that have existed for
Or worse.
4,000 years in that area.
So I've got a
And
question to answer your question.
okay, all right,
I think it's especially around the conflicts. I think exactly what I found when you look at the wars that were declared wars, I think everybody would pretty much agree. And I think it's interesting too, because the sentiment from everything I can tell around those was pretty unified as a nation. Take the Civil War out, obviously not very unified during that one. But except for that one, the sentiment and the way the troops were treated, the feeling about it, it was more heroic, and like we were helping save not only the US but the world. And it seemed like the world viewed our engagement in those pretty positively, especially the two world wars. Everything after that, at best, is a mixed bag. And then I think as time goes on, history's not treated them very kindly. Even the ones people supported on the front end. I look at myself again, Desert Storm, the Iraq, all that seemed like goodness based on what we knew at the time. And the more we find out, the more I find myself thinking not. And I think part of the question is our involvement, back to our very original thing, what should we engage, conflict, all that. What is, okay, if we're going to engage, we would hope to positively influence any of these things we're going to engage in. So if we take out natural disasters for a minute, because I think we can do at least a decent job at that, and throw in conflicts, and, whether it's genocide, we don't think people are being treated well, conflict, form of government, whatever, that we decide for whatever reason. And I've got a number of things I want to talk about of how kind of the decision-making process and pick at that some. But let's say we did decide to go in the conflicts, a lot of them you mentioned plus more, is our involvement really preventing any chaos, or did we create it? There's a bit of a chicken and an egg question there for me. The more that I look at these, and I've talked to people about this over the last number of years, and when you start looking at what caused some of the hatred in a region and some of our problems, and were we fighting terrorism or were we creating terrorism? I think that's a valid question. I think that best case on that answer, we didn't make it better. We didn't make people love us more, created, and I've heard a number of people talk about it. You created more generations of terrorists by killing some of these people and the involvement we've had, and specifically some of the Middle Eastern peoples. I think when we go into it, we talked about it earlier. I think being able to answer that second, third, fourth order, effect, what's that look like? And it's one of the things, I talked about on the second episode about Iran is I haven't yet to hear anybody articulate what our intended outcome of this. I know the Trump administration right now is trying to figure out how to get out of it, but is getting out, is that the goal? What would we have accomplished to say we won, we finished, we accomplished these 17 things and we're leaving? And I think that's the case for a lot of these. I think, this is the one of the hour, so we talk a lot about it, but I look back at them and I was thinking, what was our stated objective? I looked at a lot of these. I can't find stated objectives for a lot of these. We went and got involved. We lost troops. We spent a bunch of money. And I want to get into some of the propaganda in a minute of how we did that, and it was either the people wildly supported some or not, and it varies depending on what we're talking about. But it sure doesn't appear that a lot of these were clear. I think there's a why a number of these we went into that can be answered. Now, whether that why was real or not, and again, I've got some specific
another
details,
question.
but I
Right.
think a lot of them, there was a why. But I don't see a very clear what the goal was. So, okay, here's why we're going to engage. Now we're going to engage. Well, by engaging is our stated outcome up front, not a year in, 5 years in, but why did we go in and what were we hoping to achieve? And I don't see that on hardly any of these conflicts that I've looked at.
It's interesting. I did hear today trying to read across the various and sundry news outlets that have been following this from both the right and left and everything in between. And there evidently are some people within our State Department that are concerned that if we extract ourselves from Iran in the manner in which it appears that the administration would like, and it doesn't matter if we declare that we have won and that they have capitulated, that within not only the Middle East, certainly within Iran and within most areas of the world, the United States will have been defeated by Iran. And so once again, I mean, it's there may be, the horse has already left that barn. The question is, do you continue, which probably means boots on the ground? And once again, if you're going to do that, what is your purpose? What's the end goal? And even if you achieve that end goal, are you going to have to stay there for the next 2 centuries?
Well, and to that point, so we've taken we've got Marines there now, we've got the 82nd Airborne, we've got SEALs. They're building up all the ground troops right now as we speak.
Right.
And I have heard Trump himself say that, if they don't do this, then here's what we're going to do. And he's talking about blowing up their power plants. I mean, really going into an infrastructure, and that's not just hurting a regime. That cripples a country, and you start leading to people dying of disease because they don't have water. I mean, that becomes a real humanitarian problem. And so I think that's another interesting, okay, so if they don't agree to do this and they don't open up the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, that's one of the big ones right now. Is it because gas prices are going up and the midterms don't look good? Or you're going to blow all their electricity and water and everything else into oblivion for what? What is the hopeful outcome? So Halliburton can build it back. I don't know if they're still doing that kind of thing, but that's another tease toward one of my things in a minute. But what is the intended outcome of that? I mean, that to me, blowing up their Navy, okay, got it. Nuclear weapons, got it. I can somewhat reason around how that makes sense. Hitting places where their leadership is, if you think they're evil, okay, I can maybe make sense of that. But just to start carpet bombing their infrastructure and their, electrical grid and their water and their power. That seems early on when Trump's saying, we want you to take your government back and rise up and figure out who, they're not going to be able to do anything. I mean, you're going to create this massive humanitarian problem. So again, it doesn't feel like, and I don't know, I'm not part of the daily briefings on what's going on. I don't see any good, even like first order outcome of doing that, much less the second or third 5-year outcome. That seems crazy to me.
Right. No, I agree with you. It's interesting, the situation with the Strait of Hormuz. Why has everybody conceded that that belongs to Iran? There are other countries, right on the other side of that. And I did hear one sort of right-leaning individual this last week use that particular argument, saying that was an international issue. Should be an international waterway. It certainly should not be controlled by one power. But what are you going to do? They are the largest, most advanced, most powerful nation there with the possible exception of Israel, within that particular region. I've almost reached a point, and as I've tried to answer your questions about, are we to be leaders? Are we to be protectors? Or should we just be the last ones there when nothing else seems to be working? I've almost become, I guess, what I would call a Western Hemisphere isolationist. I am at that point, and I'm sorry, my European brethren, where I'm ready to say, we need to protect and we've talked about this before, from pole to pole, our hemisphere, our Americas, and let the rest of the world take care of itself. And if it can't, then that's the way things go. Okay. I'm not concerned about one nation, China or Russia, all of a sudden controlling half of the world. That's been attempted over the last 6,000 years, and nobody's been very successful with that.
Well, but
So
ironically, to your point of the hemisphere, is specifically China, the biggest encroachments they've had and the biggest kind of land grab they've had toward doing that is in our dang hemisphere. It's down in your part of the world. So while we're over in the other hemisphere, fighting all those conflicts, they're sneaking in, in South America and taking over those countries by giving them loans they can't pay back, and they take their land and their resources. They control 85% or more of the rare earth metals in the world. And most of them are in South America. So yeah, they're the biggest land grab they've had going on, and taking over power is moving into our hemisphere while we're
Yeah.
distracted.
And Carl, they're doing it economically.
Yes.
They are not doing it militarily.
No,
I
they're
remember
not going to fire
having
a shot.
Right. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you or not, but several years ago, Grand Island, Nebraska, where I happened to be living at the time, was almost the dead center of the solar eclipse that took place. That was a large
Yep.
event across the middle of the United States. So we had people from really from all over the world coming to our little burg in the central part of Nebraska. And I remember sitting down with a young man who was part of a Chinese contingent that was there. And they were there mainly to look at agriculture and that sort of thing in that part of Nebraska. And we got talking a little bit about politics. And he says that they find it humorous. This was his opinion. They find it humorous in China that the United States worries and spends so much money to make certain that they can combat the military might of whatever is happening in China. And he says, he was very, very open with his feelings. He says, we will defeat you. And he says, and we won't have to fire a shot. He says, we are going to defeat you economically. And he said, by the time you guys figure that out, we'll already, and he used the word embed. He said, we will be embedded in your part of the world, and you won't be able to extract us. Now, that's probably an overstatement on his part, but it certainly tells us a little bit about the tactics that they are using. And they've got to be loving it when the United States is spending billions of dollars on military hardware to fight, rightfully or wrongly, these skirmishes that turn into bigger skirmishes, that turn into police actions, that turn into regime changes that never hold. And the Chinese are just sitting back and kind of watching it happen.
Well, think about this, and not only economically, and not just geographically, but they're in our dang households. And this is probably another good podcast topic, is think about social media and what they've done with TikTok.
Right.
There are two versions of TikTok. There's a Chinese version that the Chinese kids get to use, super educational, time limits on how much they can use it per day, versus ours, which is not just the, 10-second clips of the dumbest parts of humanity. It's even worse. It's convincing teenagers to commit suicide. And so, and I've had this discussion with a lot of people of, oh, it's just TikTok. It's just an app. Look at what's going on with it and who controls it. What better way to, again, without firing a shot, just make our teenagers, social media is eating their brains out, and they're making it worse. And it's so bad they don't do it in their own country. That should tell you something. So yeah, they're encroaching quickly, and we get distracted in all of this stuff. And one thing I had a couple of notes on each one of these, and it's going toward your just in truth in lending. I have oscillated in my years between, I would say I've never been just an interventionist for the sake of that, but could easily be swayed that this is a good cause and we should go do it, to an interventionist. So I oscillate between those depending on what I learn. But I think even looking at the kind of the leader, protector, last responder roles, to me, that is kind of oscillating between those three. And the leader, kind of as I was thinking about what that means, we set global direction, promote democracy and stability around the world, and shape alliances and outcomes of different countries. And then protector, this one gets interesting with, are we protecting, and is it really a threat? That hits home with the whole Iran-Israel thing, but defending our allies, maintaining military dominance, and then acting on threats that emerge. That also gets into some of my false flag stuff later. And then the last responder is, to your point of being more of an isolationist, whether it's our hemisphere or whatever, where we're only going to act if directly we've got threats against us. We try to avoid foreign engagements and getting tangled up in all that. And we really focus on domestic priorities. And to me, that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from being a leader and installing democracy and nation building, to kind of the middle of the ground. We're going to sit back. We're just going to protect our closest friends, to last responder is more of the isolationist.
That's you. Wow. You set me up well here, because in thinking again about if I'm working from this more isolationist point of view, then what does the leadership look like that we should be exhibiting? And my perspective, at least from that perspective, would be We should be spending our energies, our intelligence, our resources in building up the Americas. That means not only the United States, but all of our neighbors in this particular hemisphere, not by threatening them militarily to do things the way we say that, but truly building strong relationships with these nations and helping them, communicating to them the benefits to all of us to do that. Even though our approaches may differ a little bit, but as long as we're all after sort of the same goal, that should be the leadership, not leading militarily and going in with the strongest military in the world to force change where we think change needs to be forced, but to do that more relationally than anything else. And that would involve us having to step back and admit that maybe we don't have the answers for every culture and every country out there, but there probably are some similarities anyway. Lead in that regard. From the protection standpoint, I'm tired of us being involved in anything that doesn't directly involve us. Now, that does not mean, no, you say, okay, you're going to turn your back on Europe, then no. We provide them the second tier of military hardware and technology that we have. We provide them with that. We provide them with training. Maybe we provide them with intelligence. I don't know, those things that can benefit them, but they need to take the responsibility. Now I'm sounding like Hegset of cleaning up their own backyard and doing
And
it
Trump.
themselves. And you know what?
And
If you can't,
that's the
if
pieces
you
of
can't,
Trump. Go ahead.
right. I was gonna say, and if you can't do it, then guess what? You're going to be defeated.
Yeah, and I think that's the
Sorry.
part of Trump and Hexeth both that I do like what he said is, we're carrying NATO, all these things to protect Europe. It really does. We've got his words, big beautiful oceans on either side of us. We're not, at least currently, based on current ICBM technology, we don't have the threats they have, but we spend inordinate amounts of time and energy protecting the rest of the world, at least in theory, and getting ready to protect them from something happening. And that's where I do agree. Trump, made them step up and start paying their fair share because, again, who is it protecting most? It's not us. All those organizations do not protect us as much as they do them.
Well, it begs the question, why is the United States involved in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
It's a great question.
We butt up against the North Atlantic, but that really is not our bailiwick at all. And you know that I'm a conservative Christian, but it's time we stepped away from this belief that at all cost we have to support Israel in everything that they undertake. I think it's time to back off, take the handcuffs off of them, let them do what is necessary to survive in their arena. And I've got Christian friends that are going to hear this, and they're going to I'm going to hear from them because they believe that it is our responsibility as Judeo-Christians to see to it that Israel succeeds in everything that attempts. Well, I don't agree with that. I do not think that's scriptural. Let's take a look at what God allowed to happen.
That is a lot of the
But
crux of it, though. That's where a lot of people are getting hung up. And here's one that I was listening to a podcast the other day with somebody, and Tulsi Gabbard, I will give her a lot of credit, changed my opinion a lot on this. She probably swung me from being more pro, we should be involved in more things. I didn't know a lot about her. When she started making her run for president, I listened to her a lot and was shocked. And I had a lot of friends who liked her a lot. And I was curious why. Well, they knew more about her than I did. And I took a lot of time to listen to her and found myself not really disagreeing with her on a whole lot on foreign policy. And it wasn't where I thought she was full on isolationist. Unless somebody shows up in San Francisco or New York City, we're not doing anything. That was not the case at all. What she had done is a lot of what we're doing and will continue to do as we kind of step through some of these things and how did we get involved in them. And she was looking at it from being in the military, seeing what happened, and then seeing the chaos that ensued and asking the question, were we creating our problems or solving the problems? Were we creating the chaos? No, she's looking at the vacuums we created and some of the worst problems. And the deterrence only really works if it works. And if you leave and things are worse, that's not even a good deterrent. So some of that starts falling apart. Some of the interventions we do backfire. The unintended consequences were there longer, and then we leave and things go back the same way. She got into a lot of detail of those kind of each of the instances in the last 30 years. And it was shocking to me. I didn't know a lot of those and how, again, then you get into the false flags of why we went into some of them. And then you look at the outcome and then it looks really bad at that point.
right.
But she was the one that really changed my mind. And so all that And this is where a lot of people are being very critical of her. She's got a lot of people going back and forth with her because that was one of her big things that she ended up endorsing Trump on and agreeing to be his, his right hand for intelligence and be a cabinet member. And she's put out some interesting statements, and I think she's pushed on him a little bit, but she seems to be in agreement with a lot of it. And you start looking at no, they were close to having nuclear weapons. And again, she's got levels of intelligence not only do I not have, I don't want them. I want to sleep well at
Yeah,
night.
right.
And that's the piece that we don't know. In 20 years,
Hmm.
we'll probably figure more of it out. But it's intriguing to me because she seems to be a very, very principled person who has been in the military or still is in the military. And her stance on all this has been very intriguing to me of how she's pushed at the right levels. But then, I think she would walk away before she would compromise who she is. She's not
Yeah.
gaining anything out of it. She doesn't need the job. And so that's where I'm a little cautious of people that I do respect like her. I've said often I would like her to be our first female president. I like her a lot. But I'm just intrigued because her actions through this Iran conflict are different than I would have thought they would have been. And again, a lot of people are going in really hard on her and attacking her and you're not being true to who you are. Well, I don't know. Because I don't know what she knows.
Well, let me get to that. The third leg of this stool that you created. That's are we to be the kind of the last responders? To me, that is exactly as you defined it a minute ago. Whether you knew you were doing it or not, when we are directly under attack, and I know that there can be a wide range of opinions as to what that constitutes, but I'm talking about this sort of Western Hemisphere kind of thing. There we have to respond. And I believe that we can show leadership. I believe that we can provide protection without ever involving our military. I just believe it's possible. People would say, well, how? I'm not sure I'm that smart, but right now we seem to throw everything onto the shoulders of the military whenever we want to change leadership in another country, whenever we want to protect a particular minority that may very well be minority not only in number but minority in beliefs in a particular nation. But we want to go, and we always lean on the military for that, or economic sanctions or something of that nature. I believe that if we knew how to show leadership, what we want is everybody in the world saying, God, I wish I lived in the United States. You look at what they're able to do with the resources they have, that the people in the United States and in the Americas have. And why can't we have that? Rather than trying to go in and force our beliefs and our economic policies and everything down someone else's throat at the end of a gun. When it comes to the protection, the physical protection of us and ours, absolutely. In fact, we probably could do that a lot better if we weren't spending so much of those resources to police the rest of the world. So I think all of that can take place. What I want to ask you, and I think you were leaning this way anyway, why do we find ourselves continually in these kinds of situations?
Man,
Let's face it, it's been happening since 1945.
that's a great segue, and I've got a question to answer your question, and then some points. I think there's a lot of reasons. I don't. Again, I think the intellectually lazy people like to make it political and throw in with the tribe and blame Republicans or blame Democrats. But I think it's interesting over the years, Republicans and Democrats have flipped sides at least twice on these type things of who's more pro-war. So I think
Yeah,
it
right.
can't become a Republican or Democrat thing. I think there's a lot of pressure. I don't think it's the decisions are being made based on what you said. But one important thing too, and I mentioned debt earlier, and we got all this money, but every dollar we spend, not on the military, because I am for a really strong military that we don't use. I'm a big fan of Ronald Reagan's statement. I think the problem is we don't hold to that a lot. We built, and even Trump said that he was a fan of that, and now all of a sudden we're not. And every dollar we spend, launching a missile, whatever we're doing, or engaging in a foreign country and losing assets, that's a dollar we can't do the things you're saying with. And I'm not talking about welfare, but I'm talking about to legitimately have a good educational system and do some things we need to do and have nice roads and have some of the things some of these other countries that we're spending all the freaking money to defend. We don't get some of those because we're spending it on missiles, launching it at their perceived enemy. But I think it's interesting. I'm not sure all this is about ideology. I think it's about some incentives. And this is where it gets into the sinister part. and I like alliteration. This was the question. And keep in mind, we've got the defense industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about on his way out. That was his gift as he left. And then not just to pick on the defense sector, but profit in general by conflicted individuals. There's political pressures, there's alliances and expectations from all other countries. And so here's my question. Are these decisions made on principle, profit, or pressure? Or all three of them? And does that move? And I think that's the case. And I got two specific ones that, I think are intriguing. And again, these are two that as history gave us more information and we're able to look backwards, both of these look really bad. One of them is kind of Dick Cheney and Halliburton, right? It seems like a very, and I've even got a kind of a skeptic's point of view and a non-skeptical on that. The skeptical view is he was the CEO of Halliburton, then he's the vice president, and then they end up getting a lot of no-bid contracts and other issues that sure do look like war profiteering. Some people argue the flip side of that. Halliburton was the only company that could do a lot of those things, and those contracts are typical in wartime. But again, man, the vice president who stepped out of a company and they did very, very well through all that. And then you look at why were we over there? The whole weapons of mass destruction and all that did not play out well at all. So it sure feels like there was a narrative, because each one of these, there's a narrative that builds that you get some percentage of the general population to agree, it's good or not. And then you do the thing. The problem is each one of these, when you start looking at them, it's kind of a sliding, how true was it over time?
Right.
Some of them proved to be completely false and just a false flag. And that's kind of like the Gulf of Tonkin. April 2nd, 1964, that was a real skirmish that happened. And then August 4th, 1964, there was supposedly a second event that by all accounts today never happened. And that was a big reason for our engagement in the Vietnam War, which ultimately cost 58,220 American lives. But that was able to build, there was a lot of collateral that was built off that and a lot of public sentiment that we should do it. And then by the time it's over, the troops are being spit on and not treated well. And again, so the upfront why, and at the end, when we go try to solve all this, sure feels like at the beginning, not only what we talked about earlier, are we not thinking through second and third order effects or even what's our intended outcome, but it looks like a number of these conflicts, not the wars, as you pointed out earlier, we entered them for reasons that were either BS on the scale or not completely true to get public sentiment. And that begs a big question of why? Why would we do that?
Right. No, it's a valid
Sure feels like
question.
money. It feels like the not so much principle and more like the pressure and profit side of things and the kind of those three P's.
I heard a gentleman just this week, and I apologize, I can't remember his name. I saw him on one of the news feeds, very intelligent, and was trying to make the case in support of what we were doing in Iran and what we had talked about doing with Greenland. And he was trying to explain the strategic value. And he did use the term of protection of the Western Hemisphere. That's
Yes.
what got my attention. And he talked about the pressure we're trying to apply in Cuba, what we've done as it relates to the Panama Canal, what happened in Venezuela, all of which are things I was on board with him. I did understand that. But then when he tried to bring in our taking over Greenland as being strategically advantageous to protecting us here, and then he carried it even further to taking out Iran and all of their capabilities because of the economic impact related to the Strait of Hormuz, particularly oil, but also things like helium, etc. Well, if you're going to extend that far and say we should be intervening, you can extend that to anywhere in the world then. And try to bring that back and draw that line from that event to the protection. Did I not read that little Kim is now saying that they have the capability of reaching the United States with their nuclear missiles?
Yep.
Why aren't we taking them out?
He switched to that's a real good segue to something in a minute that I'll give you my opinion on some of that. Yeah, they've switched to solid rocket motors. Well, and I think Randy, again, the Greenland one, I agree with what he's saying. There is a definite protection advantage for us being there. Do we need to take it over? we already have alliances with them. So us taking
That's
it over,
right.
I don't know it's the right thing, but
And I agree with you there. Why not strengthen our alliances there rather than saying,
geographically, yeah,
I mean, if we're going
geographically, it's definitely important to us to
because if we're
defend the
going to
U.S.
do that, then let's go ahead and take over Canada,
Right.
and let's go ahead and
Well,
take over Mexico.
yeah,
I mean, why not? I
I
mean,
know.
they're right on our borders, and certainly according to the Trump administration, especially as far as Mexico is concerned, they're a definite threat.
Well, the
We won't
problem
even
is
have to build the wall. We won't have
we've
to build
got
the wall to take
that's
them
right.
over.
We've got bases in all these places anyway. So, it really is creating, in my opinion, strong alliances with Greenland, which we have. So a lot of that's rhetoric. It's getting people to look over here when he's doing something different. I don't believe he ever intended that we would take over Greenland. Again, I think he says crazy things to get people to focus on it while he's getting ready to go invade Iran. So I think there's some of that. But I think something you just mentioned. So there's the do nothing option of all this that we haven't really talked a lot about, but that's more on the isolations piece. So there are consequences to that too. Inaction, this is something I heard a number of years ago that I think is intriguing. Just like action has consequences, inaction is a decision and also has consequences. I don't think we have a long track record of indecision and doing nothing because
All
we
right.
don't seem to do that. We seem to get involved pretty quickly. But I think that when it's all being laid out, and even take the Iran one and play that one out. Okay, so if we did nothing, and we talked a little bit about this during that podcast, but we take the do nothing option and we wait, and whether it's 2 weeks or 10 years or whatever, whenever they really get a nuclear weapon, okay, what's the third order effect of that? Are they going to do anything with it? Pakistan has them, India has them, a lot of people have them. So I don't, because that is another course of action, doing nothing. And I don't think we ever play that one out very far to really look at it, because I do think we are excited. Lindsey Graham's excited and others are excited. And, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, the market goes down, their stock keeps going up. The more missiles we shoot, somebody's got to rebuild them. So I think there is pressure to not way overanalyze the do nothing option, but we gotta act. And then you bring up something that I think is very intriguing, and you hit this one on another one. But to me, one of the annoying things is the lack of consistency. Because if we lay the rules up of when are we going to get, when are we going to be the leader, when are we going to be the protector, when are we going to be the last, when are we going to wait until absolute last piece and be interventionist, we're not consistent on those. We're not consistent from decade to decade. We're not consistent from country to country. Genocide, not genocide. Little Kim is a good example. You brought that one up. If they really are doing they're further along than Iran. So if they can hit the U.S., it really doesn't matter where they're located. Why don't we go carpet bomb them tomorrow? If it's about genocide and Iran was killing a bunch of protesters, that's an interesting topic. I've heard, they killed somewhere between 3,000 and 30,000, depending on what sources you look at. What about when China was killing the Uyghurs and what was going on in Hong Kong? We didn't do anything there. So it's very selective as to when, Ukraine, when Russia invaded, we're not involved in that. We just give them all their weapons and money and everything else, which I think is interesting as well. Russia's doing the same thing against us right now. How do you think Iran is blowing up these AWACS planes and the other things they're doing and know where they are? It's because Russia's giving them the dang information. So Russia and China right now they're playing us, what we do to Ukraine. They're doing the same thing with Iran. So I thought about it this morning. I was listening to a podcast. I was listening to Mike Baker, his presidential daily briefing. I love it. It's great. 15 or 20 minute, what's going on in the world. Former CIA guy that has a really good world perspective. It's not his take on it. It's just what's going on based on what he
Right.
knows. Today, I was listening to it and I thought, everybody's talked about World War III. We are in the middle of a proxy World War III right now,
Yes.
because everybody has chosen teams. China and Russia are on Iran's side. We're on Israel's side. We're on Ukraine's side against Russia. China has done operations with Russia. So if all you had to do was get a little more active in each of these conflicts, we're in a world war.
Right.
It's already happening. Then you throw
No,
in the
that's true.
cyber attacks that are going on. It's just we're fighting a world war by proxy right now. It's not necessarily, we haven't gone into Russia ourselves, supposedly. We haven't gone into China, and they haven't come here. But yet we're all doing things to each other via poor freaking Ukraine. We're blowing the heck out of them, and Iran, they're caught in the middle of this world war. But it's kind of like everybody's converging on these two pieces of property, fighting world wars through them and on their property. And I think the lack of consistency, it makes it hard to believe that of the three P's, everything's principled. Because if it were, I think we would see more consistency.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely. We are missing that lighthouse to focus on to keep us, on the right path. And I think that's why there's really no coordinated communication as to what the purposes are, what the end game is,
Do you think that's
because
because they're
I don't believe there's principle.
Do you think well, and that's what I'll say, and let's be charitable for a second. Let's say it is principle. I don't believe it is either. It doesn't feel that way. Based on the lens we're able to look through it now, it doesn't feel that way. Let's say it is. If it is it because they think we're too stupid to understand the outcome, they don't tell us? It's too hard to come up with it? Because, I mean, again, if I try to be charitable and say, "Oh, it's principle, but we're missing something," it sure feels like they think we're either too stupid to understand or they can't tell us because they can't tell us. But we don't have the benefit in any of these conflicts we've talked about of knowing we get a why. And again, we've gone through just a few whys of they're not even legit whys, but we don't get the benefit up front or later, even a year later, 10 years later, and 20 years later in some of them of what's the intended outcome. I don't think they have it. I don't think they get that far down the pathway. This gets even crazier because think about this. I always worry if I see bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, I believe there's shenanigans because they don't agree on anything. And so if I see like a 99% vote, that to me is corruption. That means somebody, money's flowing through the Ukraine back to the House and the Senate because there's no bipartisan support. And the only thing we've seen, over the last number of years that the House and the Senate agree on, Republicans and Democrats agree on, for the most part, for a long time, is we got to fund Ukraine no matter what. We don't even know what we're doing or why, but by golly, we got to fund them. And I think part of it is I think we go into something. I mean, if you look at the 20 years we spent in Afghanistan, that whole thing went across multiple administrations. And so the person who was responsible or the administration who was responsible for the upfront while we were doing it, they were long gone by the time we're leaving. And in between that, neither one ever came up with here's what we're doing and what our hopeful outcome is.
Right.
So here's a question for you, and this is something that I've listened to Mike Baker talk about this. I've listened to Mike Benz talk about it. They've got differing perspectives, and their perspective is, if not the U.S., then who? And Mike Baker's a CIA guy. Mike Benz is a former State Department guy who, thinks the State Department's the root of a lot of the evil in the CIA, and then USAID is doing it. But I think Mike Baker brings up an interesting point is if we don't go do some of this nation building and the CIA is not helping pick new leaders and all, who does do it? Is China going to step in and do it? Is Russia going to step in and do it? And that's where I argue with myself about the isolationist piece is if we don't do this, and if we are one of the best nations on the planet with good intent and we don't do it, who will?
But let me answer your question with a question. Why does it need to be done?
I agree.
I mean, look at the Soviet Union. It actually imploded upon itself. Now it
Well,
helped
I'm not talking as much about the big ones. I'm saying in these smaller countries. If you look at kind of us and Russia and China and say it's this continual power grab of who gets to rule the world monetarily, is the US dollar that? If we don't go involve ourselves in some of these places where there is unrest, do they do it and then do more of what we said, and do they end up in Venezuela? If we don't go take out Maduro, does China end up siding with them and taking over Venezuela?
Well, this goes back to my my, I guess, hemispherical isolationism. Yeah, I think we have to have a much more concerted effort in doing it. And again, not necessarily militarily, not strong arming these nations, because that never works for any length of time. Okay. But yeah, we focus our energies there. We do not focus it on Ukraine. And that is not to slam the brave people of Ukraine and what they're having to put up with. But you know what? We can't save everyone. And I don't even know what save everyone means.
That's a very complex topic.
If you're going to define that as turning them all into Iowa City, Iowa, it ain't going to happen. Okay. Nor should it happen. So I don't know. Again, I think it boils down to there needs to be a specific focus in which one can articulate the benefits to our nation and more broadly to the world. You really, we have to be careful about saying that this is what's better for the Middle East because we're looking at it from an American perspective, and that is not valid. I'm
Well, and even
sorry, it's
picking
not.
sides in Russia and Ukraine. And again, I sat down
Yeah,
and
right.
watched Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. He spent 25 minutes explaining to Tucker, the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. And you and I talked about this when some of this was first popping off. There were a lot of promises made to Putin. And I'm not defending Putin or what he's done, but it is good to understand. And situationally, as things encroached on what he thought he had been told, if Russia and China started moving into Mexico and taking over Mexico, would we have a problem with it? Or Canada? Probably.
Of course we would. I think we
Cuba,
would. Yeah.
we've done it. I mean, we have had a problem
Right.
with Cuba for many years for that exact reason. We're doing it right now. We've got, again, the proxy war is also being fought in Cuba because whether we're letting Russian tankers go there or not is going on right now. So we're fighting over Cuba just in an economic way right now, in a blockade kind of way. How do we choose sides in Russia, Ukraine? Because again, is it us trying to make them into Iowa? Is it us trying to defend the good people or bad people? Well, yeah, Putin invaded, but why did he invade? And did we have are we complicit in any of that? Sure feels that way when you go back and look at some of the things he was told wouldn't happen and they did.
Well, I think part of it also is not going to disappear. We still, as a nation, view the big bad Russian bear as being evil, and they very well may be. But we're still talking about a generation that does remember not only World War II, the aftermath of World War II, Stalin, and then the USSR, and the strong arming of all the surrounding nations, et cetera, which, by the way, we allowed to happen after the Second World War. So we've got some generations here that's all they've ever known. So that we're going to side with Ukraine. It doesn't matter. They may be just as evil
We know they're
as
corrupt for sure. Whether they're evil or not,
exactly.
they're super corrupt.
So, but they're still better than Russia, and Russia is even worse than China. China's at least slightly better than Russia. At least
Yeah.
if I read the American
Yeah.
people as I think that I do. And so we've got these sort of gradations of evil out there. And I mean, let's
And
face it.
humans we like disagreement, conflict, war. It's been going on since the beginning of mankind, and I do think that has been part of the problem with what's going on in the United States with a lot of the infighting and the othering, and is if we don't, because we had Russia we had the Cold War. So we had Russia, they were our enemy. We all agreed on that. That got better mostly, but there's still lingering effects, obviously. Then what happened next? Terrorism. September 11th happened, so we don't like terrorists. Well, as that all starts dying down and the news cycle lasts about 15 minutes, we don't have a natural enemy right now. Iran, I guess, is, but that doesn't feel the same as Russia or the terrorists because they didn't come here and do anything to us. And the threat of them doing it wasn't as bad as what it was with Russia, that they could end us or they could invade. And I think that is part of what causes a lot of the infighting, though, is we start fighting each other. And it's spring practice right now. In football, I bet there's fights, and I bet by the time they get to late summer, think about when you played football, how did that go? By the end of, spring practice, 2 days in the summer, before we get to the fall, there's at least 3 or 4 fights every day in practice.
Sure.
Because you're tired of beating on each other. And then what happens when the season starts? All that goes away because you've got a common enemy you're about to hit. And so I think some of this problem we're talking about is even human nature. We like to go find somebody to fight.
Right. Well, something for us to kind of leave this on, and it doesn't answer anything, is we need to remember that we are the nation, we are the government that supported Osama bin Laden against the Russians, the ones that supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq against the Iranians. I don't know if it can be any number of things. Either there is some illicit rationale that's driving that we don't know anything about. Maybe we're just too stupid to stop sticking our nose in places where it doesn't belong. I don't know what the answer is, but it does tell us we don't have the answers as a nation. We may have better intent. We may be driven by a higher purpose. I think that is entirely possible. I don't want to keep sounding like I'm coming down on our nation. I'm coming down on some of our nation's decisions, and I'm not sure who's making those and what's driving that. As a people, and what has built this nation in our year now is unlike anything else that exists. And a lot of that is because of the fact that most Americans want to do good to those around them and live a peaceful life without interfering with others and without having their own lives interfered with. That's what we want, but all too often the powers that be, those who are able to take the resources of this nation and send them in particular directions for particular purposes, they don't align with that, underlying concept of what it means to be an American and what has made this nation great. I believe it will eventually all play out. I'm still a believer that the center is much bigger than the right or the left. We're just not as loud. And maybe we'll get back to that point to, again, where if nothing else, we're able to discuss our differences rationally and try to arrive at the best solution for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. And the similar to the wrap up of the other ones is, how do we, if this is broken, how do we fix it? And you just started hitting on that. I think the center has got to demand that we understand outcomes before we go commit our nation's resources, whether we declare war or not. Because clearly, we talked about this on the Iran one, and I think both of us through research realized, I don't think this is a new thing that the president's doing something, because the declaration of war in the 250 years has been used very sparingly. And it's been pretty much bipartisan that both sides presidents have gone and gotten involved in conflicts. It's probably split about 50-50 if you look at the number of them. But I think that's where we've got to demand more accountability from our leaders and I don't know the way to do that. It's easy to say vote them all out and other things, but I do think we have voices now that we haven't had it's not just call your congressman on the phone anymore. I mean, there is social media. There's ways to reach out to them. I think the silent majority needs to speak up and voice louder. And I think we may see that at the midterms. You may see it. You may see it where, the Republicans don't win another presidential election when it looks like they may not lose one for a while. If people are this frustrated with this Iran thing, and it sure looks like a lot of the polling, it says that it is. And back to, the last podcast, if this is a now kind of a performative audience thing rather than an institution that's politics, maybe that is how some of this gets fixed. Is people vote, people are vocal about what they think, and maybe the next time before the leadership, the incumbents in the House and the Senate and the presidential or the executive branch and the whole government makes a decision to go into the next country, whatever it is, for whatever reason, maybe they do sit back and look at it and say, well, here's the potential outcome. Here's what we're looking at and the why. And I think they got to do a better job on the why. Clearly, it's easier to figure out now if the why is BS or if it's legit. I think the information that is out there now is it probably has us in a better spot than ever before to be able to force the leadership of our nation to be more articulate about the why we're doing what we're doing and for it to be legit, and then the stated outcome, ended outcome at least. And then I find myself on this one, again, Tulsi Gabbard, I'll give her credit for changing my mind on a lot of it, but and I think we talked about it on the Iran podcast. I think it's the frustrating part is the Shield of the Americas, some of the things that this administration was starting to do sure looked like they were going to make you a fan because
Right.
it was focused a lot on this hemisphere and things that we have not done at all and taking care of our backyard.
Right.
And now we've gotten completely distracted. We've spent a lot of munitions, a lot of dollars, and we're losing lives, and a lot of people, just humans in general, regardless of what country they're from, are dying. And so we took our eye off the ball and we're back to the same game we were playing. And again, even if we withdraw and say we won to your earlier, that doesn't mean we necessarily did, but let's just say we do get to withdraw and say we won. Did we win? Are we going to be back in 6 months or 9 months or 2 years? It's not going to be magically stable when we leave there. It's just not. We have absolutely created more chaos there. If we left today or we leave in 6 months or a year, it's more chaotic today than what it was when we went in there.
Well, I'll tell you, I hate to end this on a cynical note, but it very well could be, and I think it is quite likely that in order to initiate the kind of change among our leadership that you and I have been discussing, maybe what we're going to have is $7 a gallon gasoline, not just for the short term, for those that are saying, well, we just have to toughen up a little bit. Let's have it go there and be permanent and move toward 10. That will change, trust me, and it will go beyond any kind of political philosophy. Now we're talking about, we're not even talking about economics other than how it impacts my pocketbook. And it may be, it's unfortunate, but it may be that's where we have to go.
I think that's a great point. I've said that with Mamdani in New York City. I like the saying, let them eat cake. Sometimes
Right.
people want cake bad enough, let them eat it 3 meals a day for a week and see how they feel at the end of it. And
Right.
sometimes the best way to fix some things is to let people experience what they think is utopia
Hmm.
or great, and then they find out it's not that. And I think you're very valid point from a lot of people I've talked to from San Francisco to New York City to Florida to wherever. The one thing that I have found to be very bipartisan is when people's 401k goes down, when their paycheck doesn't buy as much gas or as many groceries or pay the rent as well. That seems to be a unifying effect, and all of a
Right.
sudden people agree on that. So maybe I think that might be the case, and this one sure seems to be headed in a direction of causing some pain in people's pocketbooks.
Right.
And I don't want that. I mean, the bad thing about that is that affects people disproportionate based on
Yes.
income levels. And to some people, it's a blip and it's a good time to buy more stock and invest more. And it takes away some expendable income. But for some people, it affects them being able to decide if they're going to buy gas to get to work or buy medicine for their kids or pay their rent or pay their electric bill. That's what starts happening. I think that might be one of the few things that actually wakes people up. And we've not felt that in a long time, and we haven't felt it to the level you're saying really ever. It takes something. It goes back to the saying of the most unified this country's been in a long time was September 12th, 2001. Whether it's an economic disaster, a Great Depression, some attack from the outside, whatever that looks like, somebody hits our grid, something has to unify us to take back control and hold the leadership accountable. I think that's an outside force that has to do that, whether it's gas going up or whatever, that we feel some of the pain of some of this.
Well, my positive thought is that it will happen in some form and we will get back.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. And it may be very painful for a period of time, maybe more painful than even my generation has ever felt.
Well, I mentioned it before, and it's a good friend of mine who I used to work with. It's a Marines. The first time I ever heard it said, but hard times create tough men. Tough men create easy times. Easy times create weak men create hard times. And then it just starts
Mm.
over. And
Yep,
we're
that's right.
somewhere in the, easy times creating weak men, creating hard times. We're somewhere in that quadrant of the circle right now. And that has repeated itself throughout history, not just in the US, but
That's
in
true.
humanity. And I think the good news is it does go back and it creates, hard men who create easy times again. Whether we get to experience which piece we get to fully experience is up for debate, but at least our kids and grandkids, I think there's hope for them.
Okay.
Good.
Good stuff.
We agreed. All right, it's going to be the 98.2 podcast going forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're
That's okay.
I
I know
still am
that.
holding out hope for college football though.
Well, you and I have talked about a couple of things that are, that we may look at coming up where I think we're going to find ourselves probably on opposite sides. One may be football, NIL, that sort of thing. Another is the state of education and what needs to be done about that. I don't know. We may end up on the same page there, but we
Just
are
a
talking about
teaser
our.
towards some of the college sports stuff and what we could talk about with football and money and all that is I heard Vic Schaefer, a Texas women's basketball coach, on a podcast with Mac Brown the other day, and he said something that I find to be very intriguing and it's playing out right now. All schools don't fund their women's sports and Olympic sports the same way. Well, women's basketball, it happened. Texas won another national championship, which they've won 47 straight conference championships now, which is insane. But they won another national championship in swimming. But if you look at the women's basketball right now, what's happening, you're starting to see it's not just the historically good programs with women's basketball, but the people who are spending money on women's sports, the games are not fun to watch. They're starting out 25-9. I mean, Texas beat Michigan by 37 last night, and they were up over 40. And Michigan is a good. I mean, their men's team is, they might be the same way, the way they're beating people. But you're getting to see on a big stage the effects of spending money in specifically women's basketball and how lopsided these games are between. I mean, Michigan and Texas both have money and have the ability to do it. One's choosing to spend money on their women's sports and one is not. And I think it's becoming evident. And the problem is college football is going to look very similar when you really start playing out. Bob and I were talking about it today to your Cody Campbell. If it's one person spending money, what's their appetite when they don't get the desired outcome and how long can it last? And if it's a money thing, it becomes maybe not as fun.
Yeah.
Preview of what's to
Well,
come as we get closer to
okay,
fall.
I got the answer to all of that. So
All right, good. That's a
we'll look at that
preview
down the
for
road.
everybody of what's to come as we once we solve the world issues and world peace, all that. I mean, I think we're only another couple episodes away from having that pretty much knocked out. We'll get on to the harder topics like NIL and college football and fixing that. Good.
All right.
All
Sounds
right.
good.
Excellent.
Enjoyed it.
Yes, sir.
Hey, you have a great week, man.
You as well.
All right. Take care.